I had to pee, so I started knocking on the door as the officers passed by, asking if I could please use the bathroom. They all ignored me like I wasn't their business, as if I were not 9 years old. I stayed in that holding cell all day. They couldn't reach my parents, my mother was at work, and my father was in the streets. I gave them the only phone number I knew by heart for my auntie Donzelle, my mother's older sister. The sheriffs eventually dropped me off at her house about 3 miles away. I don't remember what she had to say about it. I only remember my father's words the next day when he came to get me. You know I'm gonna beat your ass when we get home. He had nothing to say to me except those words. Tears started falling. He never once asked me what had happened. All he needed to know was that I'd been arrested. So, Earlonne, if you wouldn't mind speaking to why you felt it was important to include that in your introduction. This is when we first get to know who Earlonne Woods is. So, why did you find it important to add that portion of your childhood in the book?
In retrospect, I think it was mainly because of that was the first negative interaction I'd had with police officers. So I think a lot of my perspective changed when it came to law enforcement in that moment. Because when I say that, I was cool with sheriffs. Like I say in there, they were our sponsors to our football team. So a lot of the detectives were our coaches, and they hung out with us. So that just gave me a different perspective of uh, police officers. And I don't want to say it was the trajectory of what happened in my life, but that was the beginning of my interaction with them, and it was many after that. So
Right, and I didn't read everything from your introduction. So, is there anything else you feel we need to know before this story continues as to how we got to this is ear hustle that you would like to add to your introduction?
maybe a gang of juvenile delinquency.
Okay.
You know, starting off hanging out with your partners. Y'all think it's just a little group, but then it turns into gang activity. Then that leads to crime, leads to prison. So it was just a trajectory road that I took with not everybody in my neighborhood, but most of us that had like lack of supervision, we kind of ended up that way.
And what I think, and I'm gonna get to your introduction as well, Nigel, but what I think is so interesting about the sections I had read and what stood out to me was that you're explaining to us your behavior, but no one asks at that young age why you were acting in the way that you were acting. You know, you wanted to go to special ed class because you wanted to get out early, and then they put you in a box. And that what it does to a child in the mind of a child. And then when you end up getting arrested for actually trying to help people get by, who was going to be upset for having to sit there at that crossing road and no train is going by. So I found that very interesting. And then how that ends up going into the book of how when we know someone has a felony, we don't ask their story. We just know that you've been arrested and that's the end of the story.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, the officers could have said, "Hey, don't do that again."
Right.
Basically, they could have just said that.
Or they could have asked him why was he doing it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Especially at 9 years old.
Definitely.
So Nigel, in your story, it starts off a bit differently. You start us off, and once more, it's just going to be various sections. You say prisons generally don't welcome access or communication. Theirs is a sequestered world, and to most people, an unknown place constructed in the mind and scripted by bad TV, sloppy journalism, and tired Hollywood films. It suits most of the public to see prisons as institutions built to keep people in and keep people out. Prison didn't come into my life because I had been incarcerated or was visiting a family member or a friend inside. It didn't come into my life because I was especially concerned with prison or issues surrounding our punitive systems. It came into my life because I love to follow odd clues, seemingly random coincidences. I've always been drawn to small details that others may cast aside as insignificant or worth avoiding. I spent 20 plus years teaching and working as a visual artist, exploring ideas through solo work in my studio. That's where I was when my life's trajectory started veering toward the San Quentin parking lot. Whenever I'm working, NPR is on. I find it soothing to listen to the sound of voices, often get ideas from the fragments of stories that make their way into my thoughts while I'm otherwise engaged. One day, a story about crusty prison in St. Petersburg, Russia caught my attention. The shocking story was described in incredibly visual terms, and I couldn't stop thinking about what it would be like to be incarcerated there and have it become a sight for tourists. It took some time, but once I fix my sights on an idea, I tend to be relentless until I make it happen. While visiting my sister Amy, who lived in Sweden, I managed to make it from Stockholm to St. Petersburg for a few days. I asked everyone I met about the prison, but no one seemed to have even heard of it. I started to wonder if it was possible that I had simply had some delusional daydream and cooked up the whole thing. Had I conflated this wild story to suit my imagination? On my final day, reluctantly resigned to let it go, I packed up and my husband and I left for the train station. We arrived early, so we took a short walk. To my amazement, our aimless wander landed us directly in front of Krusty Prison. I walked around a bit, viewing the surroundings. I observed every rock, every industrial side street, trying to imagine what it would be like to view them from the different windows above. My eye was drawn to the ground, not far from those high windows. I walked closer to what appeared to be dozens and dozens of odd cone-shaped objects. During our travel home, I had begun thinking about it as a communication cone, an attempt by the people inside to correspond with the outside world. Nonetheless, I found the endeavor a deeply human, poignant, and willful gesture of survival. The cones were a way for the individual inside to let the world know they still existed. I'll never know the truth of those cones, whether they represent a willful gesture of being or a form of nefarious communication. Most likely, it is a combination of motives. Regardless, these cones acted as seeds that would germinate into interests which preoccupy me to this day. How communication occurs within prison, how incarcerated people communicate with the outside world, and how those on the outside stay connected with their loved ones inside. And so, Nigel, if you wouldn't mind speaking to why you felt it important to include that part of your story.
Yeah, so as it says in the reading, I love to look at tiny things, things that a lot of people don't pay attention to. And I think that's where the important stories are. And I also equate it to asking people questions and listening carefully. Just like with Earlonne's story, if the police officer had asked a question and listened, the outcome would have been really different. And so I like to use found and lost things as a catalyst to think about connections to other people. And I don't know if it's clear from that reading, but on the ground in front of the prison in Russia were these 8-inch cone-shaped objects with weighted paper on the bottom. They were all over the ground. There were hundreds of them. And it just caught my interest. And I found out that people inside the prison throw them out as a way of communicating with the outside world. And I took it as a gesture of saying, I'm alive, I exist, I want someone to know I'm here. That's obviously a very romantic version of that, but it really pushed me to think about what is in prison and what needs to come out of prison. So I think it just points out that I'm very interested in the details in life, and that Ear Hustle stories are really about the small details that hopefully people can connect to, whether you've had experience in prison or not.
Absolutely. And if you guys could just take a moment to also speak to that writing process when you were introducing us to yourselves as well as the podcast, because it was a lot of moments where your writings will overlap as if you guys were sitting right beside each other writing it, which is also speaks to your relationship, I believe. So if you could just speak to that process.
So we wrote this book actually during COVID. It gave us something to do. And for me, writing a book had always like intimidated me because I'm not the person to organize all my thoughts. So I can write about something and it'll be 10 different topics in that one paragraph, you know. But luckily we had a great editor that helped us keep focused. So I think the editor, you definitely use the editor, I could say that. Because definitely she kept me focused because I go outside the lines.
Well, one of the things we did with writing the book was to do a lot of recording. And I found that really helpful. We obviously wrote a lot, but to just speak unedited into a recorder, I recommend that to anybody. It's a great way to kind of get your thoughts going and not feel intimidated. And we were doing it together, and that made it a lot easier. We had already been working together since 2013. So I always got to bring my fingers out. That's 6 or 7 years. And so we knew each other well, and we know each other's strengths and weaknesses. As Earlonne said, he's not very organized, and surprise, I'm super organized.
Say that.
So we find ways to support each other, and it was a fun process. It would have been daunting to do alone, but we also had spent so much time speaking together, creating Ear Hustle, and also on the mic together. So I think we understood each other's rhythms and humor and the way that we see things.
And you definitely get that from reading the book, especially when it breaks off to where Earlonne, you have your say in a piece, and then Nigel, you come in, and I'm telling you,
I think you should start by how did you get to San Quentin? Because that's part of it.
So I was in another prison. I was in a prison called Sentinel State Prison, and I was there for 12 years. And even though they have this thing in California where you certain custodies, my custody had dropped from a level 3 to a level 2, but they would never move me. So while I was there, we were on like a 10-month lockdown. And on the Discovery Channel was a show called San Quentin Film School. And I've always been into storytelling and into film. So I was like, I want to go there because they got film. They teaching this stuff. And year after year, they wouldn't let me go. So I technically played the system against itself, signed up for the mental health program after watching a gang of Zoloft commercials. And and I went in there with the right thing to say. And that's how I ended up getting to San Quentin. And when I got to San Quentin, I was like, yeah, man, where the film school at? They was like, we don't have that no more. They're like, but we got the equipment though, so we can, teach ourselves that stuff. So I ended up volunteering for that program, and we used to do like videos of graduations. And while I was in that media center, that's where I ran into Nigel.
Yeah. So I was volunteering, teaching at the prison. I did that for 3 semesters, and I got more and more interested in figuring out how to spend more time at San Quentin. And I found out about the media lab, and I started volunteering down there. That's where I met Earlonne. And myself and a group of guys started a radio project, and Earlonne was part of that. That was in 2012. And we did that for about 3 years, and it just wasn't quite working out. I was getting a little frustrated, and I wanted to do something that was less news oriented and more storytelling. And so I'd gotten to know Earlonne, and I asked him if he would want to kind of move away from the radio and do a podcast. And he said yes. And then he said, what's a podcast? We figured it out from there. And our big idea was that we were going to do a podcast to play just inside San Quentin on the closed circuit station. And if we were successful, we would get it played in all the prisons in California, which are 35. So that was our mission. And while we were doing that and learning how to make a podcast, I heard about a contest that Radiotopia was putting on looking for a new podcast. And we got permission from the administration to apply for it. And we did. And you're the numbers dude.
So I'm the numbers dude. Out of 1,537 other, 1,536 other contestants in 53 different countries, we ended up winning. So change, and then after that, we had to learn how to.
Robinson, who, if you listen to the podcast, he's retired, unfortunately, is a person who really helped us. He was a great advocate. But after he won, he told me that he only let us apply because he never thought we could possibly win. And so after we won, the prison was the same thing, like, how are we going to make this work? But we did, and we ended up playing the podcast outside the prison system before we ended up playing inside of all of the prison systems, which is kind of crazy. And within the first month, we had over 1 million downloads, and it kind of just took off from there.
So what was your thoughts when, you won Radiotopia, now you have to start the podcast, you actually have to interview people. So what was your first interview? Can you take us into that?
Well, I'll say before like PRX and Radiotopia, before that, we was starting on, I don't know how to got that loud. We was starting on trying to put together a podcast. So I think one of the first ones we put together was between Looking Out, about pets in prison. No, Sally's was the first one we put out, but the ones for we had to. So when Radiotopia and PRX was doing this contest, when we got to the top 10, I think it was what interviews. Then when we got to the top 4, we had to do pilot episodes. So our first 3 pilot episodes, one was called The Shoe, one was called Looking Out, and one was called Misguided Loyalty. And that basically, gave us the idea of how to put them together, because each one of those episodes was probably 25 minutes long, maybe. And that gave us the insight of how to do it. But then Radiotopia and PRX sent us producers and editors to teach us a little bit more. So we definitely had some help.
So one of your main objectives of creating Ear Hustle was to bring the outside inside, to show that our lives are more alike than we like to admit. But you also wanted to prove that prison is more than the hell it's objectified as being. Why is that? Why was that so important?
I would say initially it wasn't even about the outside people at all. It was mainly, like I said, she said it was to, share inside for like people that's on death row, people that's in their cells, and put it in all the prisons. And it was technically the same type of stories. I mean, I know it may have changed a little, or
We on October 5th, 2015, Earlonne and I sat down and made a plan, and we still have this sheet that we wrote out. And one of the things was that we were not going to tell stories about crime. We weren't going to tell stories about policy. We were going to talk about how do you build a life when you are inside prison. And so that dictated the kinds of stories we were going to tell, and the details, the things that make life interesting. And I had been schooled on, I think this maybe was an intro, when I thought about prisons, I thought about really bad journalism and bad movie and bad TV portrayals. And once I started going in there, I realized that that was utter bullshit, that it's complicated and funny and interesting and devastating. All of those things are happening inside a prison. It's not like you go into prison and you're just angry person all the time. And it really bothered me that that was the thought. And it also bothered me that there's this idea that when you go into the prison, you're frozen in time and you don't grow. And so that's personally, that's what I really wanted to push back against. So when we made the stories, that's what I was thinking about. I mean, Earlonne probably had other ideas, but for me, that was super important.
no, but and the other one is, I don't know if you just said this, but usually when the media come into the prison, you can say a lot of different things to the media, but by the time that story come out, it twists your words up and you say something totally different than what you were saying. So, part of our thing was like, we're going to be able to control the narrative. And I think we did a good job of that.
You did do a good job at that. Absolutely. You then made a book and made it even better. So you guys are definitely doing a really good job. That brings us to our next part of going inside. Before I go over a few chapters that's in this section of the book, can you speak to any stories that were especially remarkable for you or that was surprising, that is still with you to this day? Because you guys are still making episodes. So from the time that you started to now, what episode or interview has been the most remarkable, and is it in the book?
Ooh, yeah. I would say it's a few, but it was one that when my sentence was commuted, we were working on an episode, and it's called Bittersweet. And it was mainly, doing a podcast. I wanted to I have a nephew he was 19 years old. He was shot 19 times by police officers. And I don't know, I just wanted to just bring him somehow in. And at the time, my brother was my cellmate. And I was able, we didn't really talk about my nephew as much, but us doing a story around it, I was able to get insight on his thoughts and his feelings about it. And we also talked to his kid's mom, who was in society. So I think that for me, that was one of the deepest episodes for me, because it was also about me getting out as well. So.
It's hard. There's so many. And then, when someone asks you what your favorite book or record is, and your mind just goes blank. But one of the ones that I still love is an earlier one called Looking Out. And it's about a guy named Roach, who's very difficult in some ways. He doesn't really like people, but he loves critters. And the whole idea of the story was to talk about finding love and giving love in a place that's not set up for that. And so I loved getting to know him and his delightful peculiarities. Like he would walk around with a box full of snails, or he'd take his hat off and there'd be a praying mantis under it. But he really loved, that's where all of his love went. And it was a really beautiful story. And in that story, you learn about his love for critters, but you also learn about what happened to him growing up and how his mother tried to drown him. And then he went into custody. And he said in the story that after that had happened, he never saw his mother again, and he can't remember her face. And that struck me as such an incredible loss and erasure of a relationship. So a story that has that kind of pain and deprivation mixed with delight and beauty and wonder is the kind of story that I really connect with Ear Hustle and that we're allowed to do. And again, for me, that shows that people are three-dimensional in their experience. They aren't just one thing. So even though that's an old story, I go back to that all the time, thinking about Roach.
Because I think today we put out story number 96.
We're almost at 100.
Damn.
Well, I'm talking about we. Like I'm.
Yeah, you
They're
are
almost
we.
at 100. So yes.
It's us.
And Roach's story is Roach. Yes, his story I remember vividly because I remember listening to it in the podcast. But then reading it, you do just get this different type of sentiment. Even that entire section of how people are finding love through different pets that they're finding throughout the prison. So that was definitely an amazing chapter in the book, which is available after the discussion. So now going deeper into it, I wanted to talk about Joseph, and I don't want to mess up his name, but Joseph Crowder.
Yeah, Joseph Crowder.
Joseph Crowder's story, because I feel it most perfectly captured your aim of documenting more than the hell prison can be, especially with his mother, Carmela, who doesn't glorify prison, but she admits the ways her son was genuinely able to benefit from it. For example, he was first diagnosed with Asperger's when he was arrested. He had services that his mother admitted he probably wouldn't have had if he weren't in prison, and things of that nature. So why did you guys feel it was so important to include his story, especially so early on in the book?
Yeah. So, this is a guy who has Asperger's or is on the spectrum. And you can imagine in prison, that's incredibly difficult because of the sounds and not being able to read people's facial expressions and understand when you're in danger or when someone's manipulating you. And so that's what initially drew us to the story, and trying to get him to be comfortable to talk with us. It's always a challenge to get someone to open up and talk about troubling things. And so I don't think I'm a bad person. I enjoy those kinds of challenges. I like to see how I can connect with people. And he had amazing stories to tell. I remember the first thing about, he had to figure out how to make soothing objects for himself. And one of the things that he did was to create, he remembered as a child, he had this bunny that he would play with when he was feeling anxiety and fear. And so in prison, he tried to make one for himself out of a sock. And he filled it with other socks, and he would sleep with it and use it as a soothing toy. And eventually a CO found it and accused him of it being a sex toy and threw it out. And so I just think of things like that, like how do you learn how to function? And he eventually got out of prison. Oh, but before that, so we wanted to interview him, and then we wanted to interview his mother, because obviously prison doesn't just affect the person who's incarcerated, their family members that also get drawn into it, and the helplessness that they feel and the fear that they have for their loved ones. And so we wanted to talk to her about how she dealt with her son having the sentence and knowing that prison was going to be particularly hard for him because of his condition. Yeah, and I think that's one of the first moms that we traveled to talk to in person. Yeah, and then he had, I don't know how much you want me to go into it.
Because I was going to ask you the question of when you guys actually are with him when he's destroying the object.
Yes.
and what that moment was like. Because I know what it was like reading it, but to actually be present in that moment.
Yes. So when he went to prison, he left behind his objects. He calls them Christmas boxes. There were like 5 boxes, and his mom was holding on to them for him. And he remembered that there were some objects in there that he felt that were imbued with danger, and he really didn't want them to exist anymore. But when he got out of prison, he was on parole and he couldn't go out of a 50-mile radius. So we went to his mother's house that was about 100 miles away and picked up all the boxes for him and brought them to my studio. And then we brought him there, and together we went through all of them. And then he destroyed the objects that he thought were difficult for him. So we had a hammer, we had like, I don't know what other stuff. He destroyed them. We wrapped them all up. We burned some things and did these different rituals. And then he took the things that were most troubling to him and threw them into the ocean. So for him, it was cathartic. And, we had met him in prison. We had talked to him in there, and then we're able to follow up with him after. And it was a pretty amazing day, I think.
You got one part of the story wrong.
Uh-oh.
I had to go to Bakersfield and get them boxes.
But then we went to his mom's.
Bakersfield is a crazy place at nighttime. But we did go to his mom's house.
Yeah. And then another section was memory. And in this section, you take the archival images from San Quentin State Prison that were taken between 1938 and 1980, and you ask each person, what do you see?
Yeah.
And through that, you get to know about their time of being incarcerated. You get to know about their childhood. You get to know about so much from one image.
Yeah.
So why did you find it important to, or what sparked the idea to even make that an episode?
Yeah, so I had gotten access to this group of archival images. They're in this book here. They were all taken by correctional officers, and they document life inside San Quentin in an amazing way, from images that are violent and terrible to, like your hustle, to images that are really beautiful, of family visits, of guys playing basketball on donkeys, all kinds of strange things. And so I wanted to archive the collection and save the negatives, but I also wanted them to be interpreted in a way that I couldn't possibly do. So I worked with a group of men inside, about 8 to 12. Earlonne was actually one of them. This is before the podcast. And we met, and they would look at the images and they would write about what they saw in the images, kind of read the images for the details. And I believe that when you look at a photograph, you interpret it through your own experience. And so when you listen to someone talk about what they see in a photograph, if you listen carefully, you're really hearing autobiography. And so the men, I believe, use the image as a kind of autobiography to talk about their own experiences in prison, and to help us, the viewer, understand the photographs in a different way. And so as an episode, so I'd done that. And then as an episode about memory, we brought different guys in and had them look at a photograph and then talk about a memory that it sparked for them in prison. And it was endlessly fascinating. And it was about asking questions and listening carefully.
Absolutely. And in this section, Earlonne, you end up saying different images that sparked memories for you. So was this a personal episode for you as well? Or, I mean, I just wanted to...
You got me thinking about the episode. It's, so from what she was saying, like I guess a trip, when you look at a picture, you don't realize what's all in the picture, but when you're in prison, you really analyze the picture. You really look at everything in the picture. So her class, it was really a great class, because you get to marking what you think is this, what's that. But I think that the memory, I was the next episode, wasn't I?
So I remember it was one image of a young lady. It's a man and his girlfriend. They're having an intimate moment, right? And that has sparked memories for you.
Yeah, I couldn't tell you what memories it sparked for me right now.
Okay, so it must have just been in the moment.
Yeah,
it felt so personal in the book.
No, definitely,
No, I get it.
Because we did actually, when it came to the episode, we did 2 episodes, 2 different memory episodes, one with a guy and then one with me and somebody else, huh?
Oh yeah, the last, with Michael.
With Michael, yeah. Yeah, no, so yeah, my mind is kind of blank on a lot of this stuff.
Okay.
Because I haven't read this book since probably we wrote it and edited it and all the rest of this stuff. But
because I can go to a topic, I know your mind is going to be filled with ideas, and that's choose one. So,
True.
so if you could just first explain to us what is Proposition 184 that was established in 1994, and why did Choose One come into existence as a response?
So Prop 184 was passed in California. It's called the three strikes law, where if you have two or more felony convictions, then you end up getting a life sentence. If you have one, that's one. But then if you have two, they'll double your sentence. If you have three prior convictions, you can get a life sentence. And it came out in 1994, and a lot of people got arrested for petty stuff and received life sentences based on their past. With me, I committed a crime when I was a juvenile, but when I got out of prison, I was out 2 years, 10 months, and I was accused of attempted second-degree robbery, and I received a life sentence for that. And, everybody that's in prison, you fighting it, you try to fight it through the legal system, and the legal system don't work for you. And so my whole thing was, how do we change this law? That's on the books saying that, hey, we don't care what you're doing, what you did in the past is the past, but we're gonna give you double jeopardy. We can't say it's double jeopardy, so we're gonna say it's an enhancement. So my whole mission was to try to change the law, which we're still trying, and I don't know how many years it is later. But Choose One was the organization that I created when we was in prison. It was called Could Hip Hop Overthrow Oppressive Sentencing Enactments? And I was hoping that, the hip hop world was our political party. But they don't give a shit.
Yeah, you take me to my next question. Why did you target hip hop artists specifically? And did you feel that they failed the people that they knew their music was impacting and who essentially funds their career by being listeners and etc.?
Yeah, I think the hip hop world have a big platform. Part of that platform is talking about crime related stuff, kill, murder. And it was, in me hoping that, through some type of dialogue, we could be able to say, hey, look at what we can do, And I had a couple of dudes reach out to me. One of them was Nipsey Hussle, and as soon as I got out, he got killed. So it was a trip. I'm still, actually, we're doing a documentary about it right now. So they might not like what I have to say in this documentary, but definitely gonna put them on blast.
It has to be said.
Definitely.
What I found interesting about your story, Earlonne, and it was a lot of people with the similar stories that you didn't even know that you were next up for being three strikes. You didn't know that your prior conviction had doubled. So can you speak to that as well? That shock of I'm a three striker.
So the law is if you have again one strike, it's nothing. But if you have two, they're gonna double your sentence. If you have three, whatever, you get life. So for around, I'm gonna just say 7,000 people that have life sentences, they never got the doubled up sentence because they had already had convictions. So the first time they committed a crime after the law came out, if they had previous convictions, then they went straight to life. It wasn't a doubled up sentence. So my whole mission again is to change that because it's a flawed law. They sold it as one thing, but nobody read the language. They only was looking at the TV commercials. Right. And the details is in the language. It didn't have a washout period. It didn't have where you can petition the courts. At first, the judges didn't even have discretion, but they changed that later and to give the judges discretion. Not that they gave discretion, but they did put it on the books. And what was the rest of your question?
No, I was just saying, like, what was that moment like when you had found out when you were being sentenced that you were a three striker, since you didn't know prior to this moment?
So yeah, I didn't know until we was arrested. So when you get arrested, they give you this certain color wristband, and then you realize what's happening. So I had a long time to really internalize what was going on. But it was a shock, to know that you were part of this law that you did. It came out while I was in custody, so you really didn't have a broad view of it. But it's still on the books today, right. And it's in a lot of different states, not just California. So it for me, it was very impactful because it's more than just me. It's my parents, my kids, all that. So it affected a lot of individuals, and again, sometimes it don't matter, what your crime is. It's just that you have previous convictions. Like I said, they was giving people life sentences for stealing socks, stealing food, stealing cigarettes, whatever the case may be. But yeah, it's a devastating loss. So it definitely hurt.
Absolutely. And thank you for sharing. Before I move on to how we got to have you sitting here before us today, I just wanted to talk about a moment that was really interesting because there was a point in the book where I knew I wanted to ask you about women's perspective. And then you guys already answered my question by saying someone reached out to us and said, we need female perspective. So when you finally did get those female perspectives, do you feel like it had opened up your podcast in a way that you hadn't expected? Because those stories were incredible. And yeah,
I'll say this. We always, so of course, it's predominantly men's stories because that's where it started at. But the mission was to always get inside of women prisons. And we tried it when I was incarcerated, but it didn't work. We had the interview and everything, but they backed out on us. And then we was able to get the first woman, Sarah Cruzan, on, who she talked about her story. And the mission, I think, when I got out was a little bit easier because we were able to travel to the women's prisons.
Yeah. So, there were many pluses, obviously, about Earlonne getting out, but one was when he was inside, there was no way I was going to travel to other prisons without him because we do everything together. So that, in a lot of ways, restricted us to San Quentin. And we could do some interviews over the phone, but they're really difficult to do. And so when he got out, that was one of the missions we could really push, which is going into more female prisons, which we're doing more in California Institution for Women, and CCWF, I never remember what that stands for.
Central California Women's Facility.
Yeah, and so the stories are so different. This season, we did a story about women aging in prison. I think it might be my favorite story now. Both Earlonne and I had the same reaction that it's, for whatever reason, more difficult to see older women in prison than it is to see men. I'm sorry to say that. And so I think the first time we were both like, this is so fucking hard. But wonderful stories, fascinating stories, difficult stories. But of course, just like outside of prison, women don't get the attention I think they deserve. And so we're hoping that that's really going to be our next big push, is to be spending more time in women's prisons. I'm really excited about it and feel like re-energized.
Yeah, nobody expects to see their grandmama in prison, and I don't know. When I went in there, I don't even know what I was expecting, but I wasn't expecting to see that. And it's hard. You sit there and you chop it up with them, and it's literally, some of them been there 30, 40, 50 years, so it's kind of, it's hard,
Or the other thing, and I'm sure this happens in men's prison, meeting women who had never been incarcerated that end up in prison in their 70s. Yeah, it's shocking. It's so shocking. And most of the crimes have to do, with abuse that they've suffered, or they're, what would you say, pulled in by other people. It's a mind blower.
And I feel that also just speaks to the power of your work, because if it hadn't been for you two, we would not have known their story, their name, etc. So what you're doing is incredible. And with that high note, I would like to bring us to when your sentence was commuted, because this section, it tripped me up a little bit, because throughout the book, you're with us the entire time. And then it's like, okay, so now this is actually how everything happened. And I like that you had waited till the last part to really reel us back into reality, essentially is what it was, into how challenging it really was to create this podcast under those terms. So can you speak to the moment when you found out your sentence was commuted? Because you were all, this chill, cool, and collected demeanor is not just on stage. You feel it throughout the book of you just remaining so calm and just looking forward to whatever is ahead. And you obviously expect or want it to be something that's favorable, but it's just your whole demeanor. So yeah, just please speak to it.
I think we brought so much empathy to the system, they had to get rid of me. No, but it's the commutation process is a process where, many people don't get it. They save this for people that's probably on death row or something like that. But I had a friend of mine was like, man, you're doing all the work. You need to turn your commutation in. So I ended up submitting the application, and I think it took about, that part did, but it took about 13 days after I submitted it, and I received an interview from the governor's office, which is unprecedented. And after that interview, being that I had previous convictions, it had to go up the ladder to the Supreme Court, and they had to sign off. And about 11 months later, everybody had signed off, and I got a call that the governor had commuted my sentence. And while I was on the phone and they was telling me that, they was like, "Hey, we love Ear Hustle." So it was just like, I always say, somehow, some way, Ear Hustle created a great escape route for me. And of course, we did get tattoos, and I had gang stuff on there
I was
first.
gonna wait for that. Yes.
No, look, I had
the tattoo. Take
so
us in.
my theory was I had gang stuff, so I covered up the stuff that got me in with the stuff that got me out.
I know that's right.
Indeed.
That's powerful. And Nigel, for you, throughout this section, what I noted was you were always so hopeful, even from the beginning. And not to say that you weren't hopeful, but that's when we really started hearing the doubts, because most of your work was done while Earlonne was incarcerated.
Yeah.
So can you speak to why you even felt it important to be that transparent with us in that moment?
Definitely. I mean, Earlonne and I are partners in everything that has to do with the podcast. We created it together. It was our idea. We suffered hours and hours, so many hours working on it, trying to figure out how to go through the system. Yeah, I mean, it was really hard to do this in prison. It's still hard outside, but it's just insanely hard to do something like this in prison. And it changed both of our lives. And I love the work so much. There's no way I would do it without Earlonne. And I knew when Earlonne got out, it was up to him to make the decision if he wanted to still be involved or not. Part of me was like, he's going to want to get as far away from prison as possible. Why is he still going to want to do this work when he gets out? And I didn't want to push him, but of course I wanted him to do it. So I wanted him to make up his own mind. And I knew if he didn't want to do it anymore, that would be the end. As I said, I didn't want to do it without him. So I didn't want to put pressure on him. I wanted him to make up his own mind. And he did want to keep doing it, which was great. But after he left San Quentin, it was hard to go back in without him. I mean, I still go back in, but it was different. It was like, our partnership inside ended and transitioned into something else. And I still miss him when I go inside. I mean, we do go inside sometimes together, but it's not the same. It's different. And every project has to change. And if you are, I guess, in touch with your feelings, you acknowledge and you mourn change, and you try to figure out what's going to replace that. Mm-hmm. So I never wanted to sound like I didn't want him to get out. Of course I wanted him to get out, but I wasn't sure how things would shift.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And then 2 years after, we ended up being in lockdown, which sparked an episode that you already had of lockdown. So can you just speak to that as well? What that moment was like? It's like, now I'm in my groove. We're going to be doing this all the time. And then the world paused.
It was funny because, everybody was going through what they were going through. And we was like, bro, this ain't no lockdown. You can still go out. You can still bend corners. Because I know I used to do that. I used to put on the fluorescent yellow hat, the fluorescent yellow shirt, act like I was one of them critical workers or whatever they call it. And I used to just drive from place to place because it wasn't a real life. You can open the door and go outside if you wanted to. But we did put out an episode. Did we repurpose the episode? We had one called, what was it, Bird Baths and Lock Boxes? Yeah. Something like that, about how do you endure a long lockdown. And I think it resonated with a lot of people that were now on lockdown. So that was a fun episode to put out again.
Right.
One of the things I pride ourselves on is that we always find the workaround. You have to, if you do anything in prison, you have to have patience, politeness, and persistence to get anything done. And if you don't have those things, you're going to spin your wheels. And in the lockdown, when it happened with COVID, I think a lot of people thought we would stop working, but we just had to find a way to keep telling stories. So we set up studios in our closets. We did more stuff on the phone, and we just learned how to tell stories in a different way. And I think that's what any project needs to do. Again, you have to grow and change and not let things shut you down.
Absolutely. And while you guys were speaking, I was reminded that your newest member, or at least it was the newest one when you read the book, Rasan, he also was recently released. So congratulations to him if you're watching. Hey, Rasan.
Hey, New York.
How has it been with getting a new crew as people? Right. Can you speak to that as well? Or did the mic die? It's good.
Hello.
Okay.
Yeah, Rasan was actually commuted too. So,
Wow.
you know, if you become a host of Ear Hustle, you might
Right,
get commuted.
right. Good things are soon to come. Right. I'm saying here you go.
Y'all can hear us, huh?
Yeah. So one of the things after Earlonne got out, we had New York, Rasan, Thomas start working with us, and then he got out, and so we decided that that wasn't really a good mode to just have one person, and so we did a hiring inside San Quentin. We put out a want ad. We had people apply. They had to submit a letter of intent. We had 2 different interviews that they went through, and then we ended up hiring 16 people. So we're trying to expand the crew instead of having a host. So we're doing more training, teaching people how to record, how to edit. And our episode that came out today highlights our new crew. They each tell a story. It's called San Quentin Magazine. So I think that's the way we're going to go, is to not make it just about one person, but to try to spread the experience a little bit more.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because I mean, you know, individuals get to learn a totally different skill set, and get involved in that. I mean, there's so many people here. In San Quentin. They have like this a media center where, like I say, when I was in there, it started out as film. It has a newspaper in there, and you have a lot of individuals that's getting out, that's utilizing those skills, making documentaries, and being real successful out here. So, indeed.
Yes, thank you for speaking to that. So now that you guys are 96 episodes in, a book in, how has Ear Hustle shaped your lives and your activism?
Ooh, with through Ear Hustle, how many I've been around the world a lot. I don't know how many times now. I've been out in November. It'll be 5 years. I continue to, you know, advocate for ending California 3 strikes law. I continue to go inside the prisons because I understand my role, you know, and my role is to inspire. And I definitely see it when I walk into a prison. Like sometimes I can't even get work done because, you know, everybody's coming up all the time. I technically don't do work when I go in prison. I just sit back and talk about what the latest. But I definitely understand that a lot of this is bigger than me. You know, I understood that from day one. This was way bigger than me. I was just a vessel. So I continue to do the things that. Oh, and I can say this. People be like, "Why do you still go in prison?" Because I can walk out.
I know that's right.
I think, for me, I started this project when I was 50. And for me, it was really important at that point in my life to find new challenges and to think about how at any age, if you say yes to something, your life can change in very drastic ways. And I think all of us can get really overwhelmed by how terrible the world seems and get into a moment of stasis. And I think it's important for all of us to realize that small voices that don't necessarily seem like they have a lot of power can. And so I hope our work shows that 2 people can get together and create a really strong working creative bond, and through sheer will actually make a difference, even though on paper they don't look like they have much power. And so I hope that encourages other people to think about their own possibility. I also deeply believe, in terms of my activism, I think I can only change what I can touch. And so I believe so deeply in the power of an intimate conversation where you ask important questions and you actually listen. And it's not that hard to do. And so I hope that more people understand the power of asking questions and the second part of listening, and how that can make a lot of change. That's not for everybody. Some people have, I think, a much deeper and craftier mind and understand how politics work and can change policy. I know that's not where my skill lies. And so I encourage everyone to find where their skill lies and then to push yourself, and that there isn't a person well, I'd like to believe that there isn't a person that can't get in touch with their own creativity and their own power and figure out how to change the world even just a little bit. And then that's the satisfying thing.
Absolutely, absolutely. And before we pass it over to the audience for them to ask their questions, how can we further support your work outside of subscribing to the podcast and getting a book after the discussion?
I like him to answer the hard things.
That's not hard. Just continue to, I would say, share it. Continue to do work in your own communities. Each one teach one. As they say, it takes the hood to save the hood. Just keep doing the work, keep volunteering. Because you definitely need volunteers. Like I always used to tell Nigel, like especially in prisons, that the volunteers are on the front line of public safety. Because outside of them, well, who you dealing with? Correctional officers and other incarcerated individuals. So, I don't know if people, would like to volunteer in prison. And I believe there are some that's here that volunteers in prison. So it means a lot to individuals inside to get different perspectives. So, yeah.
For sure. Thank you. So let's go ahead and give them a round of applause.
Thank you.
And this is our favorite part of the program because this is when we get to invite you in. So we have two different options. You can either step up, I'm going to put the mic right here, and you can ask your question on the mic, or you can just use your outside voice and ask your question from where you're at. Your choice. Who wants to start? Break the ice. Don't be shy. I was saying, I saw your hand first. Yeah.
Hi. How you doing?
Hello.
My name's Shy. So I actually teach spoken word poetry at the Maryland Correctional Institute of Women, and they have a lot of stories and stuff. So my question is, like, how would you recommend like us starting a podcast there, or do you guys have the bandwidth to come out and like do some interviews and start a podcast with it?
I would think that it's always in who you know, especially inside the prison. In California, I can say it would be what's the CRM, the Community Resource Manager of prisons, and try to reach out with them. If that don't work, then you deal with the government, that runs the prisons. As far as our bandwidth, I know we are thin. We are running on fumes, but we definitely try to do anything we can, to assist and to help. The thing about Ear Hustle is it's a model of, what happens when a prison say yes to something. You don't always have to say no. It's not like no bad things gonna happen. Good things will happen. So just tap in. Let us know.
Yeah, we always love invitations to come to other prisons if we can do it. If we're in the area, we would do it. So yeah, you should just get in touch with us. We can't make a promise, but it would be great. I'd love to know more about the program.
Somehow I feel you got in touch with us before, have you?
Yeah, I've spoken to you.
Yeah, I'm like, damn, this is ringing a bell. Definitely.
Two questions. One, Nigel, you mentioned that it's some part of you that misses having him in prison in that perspective. My question is of Earlonne, is there any part of you that misses, and I know that sounds crazy, but misses being inside at all?
No. I respect the question. I definitely respect it, but nah, I'm 52. I spent a total of 27 years in prison. I'm good. I'm cool on it. I still, it's all, every day I get numerous calls from prison, so I'm still tapped in. I definitely walk in there. I definitely, and it's one thing that people laugh, so especially my partners. Every time I see people in prison, I'll be like, damn, you still here doing this shit? You know what I'm saying? But it's definitely, sometimes it's the mindset. Sometimes people can't give up certain things. Sometimes people can't give up phones in prison and they keep getting write-ups and stay in prison, So to answer your question, nah, I'm good. Yes.
Are there any episodes you maybe look back and wish you had done something a little bit differently, maybe emphasizing part of the story, or just made a different artistic choice, or something like that?
I'll let you do that one, Professor.
I'm trying to think of an example. I will tell you that I learn something from every episode, and I think we get better with every episode. So I have more of the experience. I guess I look back or I listen back and I can hear either some stiffness or not so, I mean, honestly, not so much, because I feel like we are constantly pushing ourselves. So I can't think of any story that I look back and am embarrassed by or feel like we really blew. It's not arrogance. I think it's just because we learn something with every story. So I wish I could tell you something more concrete. I have a small one.
Oh, do you? Which
Yeah,
one?
but you can tell yours.
No. I was thinking, so sometimes you make a mistake in the story, or sometimes, when it's a podcast and it go out, it's out. Like, say, for instance, we did a story. So we were based in San Quentin. So there was one story that we had to do in San Quentin, which was about George Jackson, who was one of the revolutionary cats, and he had a sentence of like 6 months to life and ended up serving 12 years before he was killed. And he was killed by the guards there. So in that story, we were interviewing some guys, and one of them just so happened to be one of the Soledad brothers, and we never introduced him as one of the Soledad brothers. We just talked about it, him, interviewed him and stuff. So I think something like that was just it was on our part. We just neglected to do it. We didn't even trip off of it. Okay, so in California, you had a few cats that were it was a very oppressive system, and these brothers banded together because they were accused of killing a police officer, and they were in a prison called Soledad, so they called them the Soledad brothers, and they shipped them off to San Quentin and to the hole. But I mean, if you look up Soledad brothers, you would definitely come up with George Jackson books about that experience.
I'm really pondering your question. I can't come up with one.
Wait a minute, maybe you have one for us.
Yeah, did you listen to one that you think we could have done better?
Not really. I think the episode I may be most interested in hearing talk a little bit more about is the one you talked about, police officer who was arrested.
Do you think we didn't handle that one right?
No, I will say no. I don't know. I was just very torn sort of between two sides in that story. It really kind of resonated with me.
I'd love to get into this. Yeah. Yeah, this was an incredibly difficult story to do. And I think it challenged, okay, but I'm going to say it challenged a lot of our listeners. Yeah, okay, and it challenged people in different ways. So I don't want us to just do stories that make it sound like everyone in prison is amazing and there aren't difficulties. And I find sex crimes particularly difficult to deal with. And this wasn't just a sex crime, it was a police officer who abused his power and was a serial rapist. And it was amazing that he would talk to us. I give him a lot of credit for that. And while he was in prison, he became a preacher. And for me, there were just a lot of questions about power and going from being a police officer who abused his power that way to becoming a Christian, which is totally fine. And I guess it's fine he became a preacher, but I wanted to ask him about that. What was the connection? Why did he still need to be someone who led instead of followed? And we had to ask him really hard questions. And during the interview, we're not journalists, so we have a different code of ethic when it comes to asking questions. During the interview, Earlonne, he described some of his crimes. And during the interview, I didn't know this was going to happen. Earlonne asked me to talk to him as if I were a victim. And I did. And my response was one of anger and finding it very difficult to believe what he was telling me. And some listeners didn't like it, and they thought I was very unfair to him. But I felt like it was important that he be asked really difficult questions and be challenged. I don't know what to think about him. It's not my place to judge him, but it is my place to ask hard questions and let listeners, I guess, decide. What was fascinating to me at the end, Earlonne asked him, if someone did to your daughter, what would you want to have happen to them? And his answer was, I'd want them to go away and never be heard from again. And that told me that even he, as the person who committed these crimes, had unresolved feelings about what should happen to somebody who does that. It's hard, and I don't mind on air being vulnerable and saying I don't have the answers. I didn't mind revealing that this crime was a very hard one for me to deal with. I had compassion for him. I respected him that he would talk to us. But at the end of the day, I still don't know exactly how to feel, and I'm not sure I have to, but I think it was okay to bring up those questions. So maybe it was one of the more controversial stories that we told. We got a lot of response, and a lot of the anger was directed towards me, which I thought how interesting in a story about sexual assault that it's the woman who people get mad at.
And so when we put episodes out, I always, read the comments and see what people says, just to, see how they resonate with them. And I was just shocked that nobody just was like, can't believe a police officer was doing this. Nobody said that. I was like, damn.
Yeah, sorry, this is such an interesting topic, and there's so much to say about it. We also had listeners say, this isn't the kind of story you're supposed to do. You're not supposed to talk about these things. And I also found that fascinating that people feel like there's only one kind of story we could tell. I like complexity. I like things that don't have an answer. I like the possibility that I'm still going to learn more and question my own assumptions about stuff. But I have to be honest, I really struggle with those kinds of crimes. And it wasn't about, is he guilty or not? I mean, he admitted to his crimes. It was known what he did. So I don't know if I have regrets about it. I've talked to him several times, and I have another meeting to sit down and listen to it with him and talk to him about it. So I won't shy away from doing that. I think it was a really powerful story. I don't know personally if it was good for him or not. He'll have to answer that for himself. But I do respect how honest he was telling the story.
And the one thing I can definitely say is that when we do talk to people, we don't, we're not there to judge anybody. We're there to meet people where they at today, So I just seen that dude Friday.
Yeah.
Friday when I was in there. I think it was Friday.
I heard what Earlonne just said. I can't tell you I didn't judge him. That would be lying if I said I didn't judge him. It was hard. It was really hard.
I can't judge people. Who am I?
Well, it depends how you describe what judge means. I couldn't. I can say it's up to God to judge people. I had feelings that weren't.
So you heard it. What was your opinion? You heard it.
I think y'all did well. I think that it was complicated, and I think I think that most listeners would have responded really negatively if y'all had approached it with never-ending kindness. Right?
Yeah.
Like this was a very different person that you were interviewing. And when you're talking about like institutions and power, like these are the folks that have the power and abusing power. And so I didn't feel a lot of empathy. I didn't feel a lot of sympathy there. But I think he had the ability to share himself and share his story, and that's what you're doing. But I certainly didn't feel like being tough in asking questions and not fully believing this person who like kind of represents institutional oppression, right? And then is still doing this crap, right? Like the preacher stuff was wild to me. But like, I don't know. I felt similarly. I felt like that if you were not too harsh on a person that holds so much power in so many ways.
Yeah, well, I don't know how listeners would trust us with any story if we don't show our own vulnerability and questions, and that we don't always know what's going to happen. And I hope that's how listeners feel. There's a couple stories that I I think about a lot, and that's one of them. And I do wonder if we could have done it differently. I don't know what that different way would have been, but all I can say is I do think about it, and I do wonder about it. And I do wonder about him, like how it affected his well-being.
This season, spoiler, it might be a part 2.
Oh.
Look out.
Yeah.
I saw your hand
Excuse me. I just want to say, first of all, thank you for your experience and bringing some reality to what a lot of us don't understand inside.
Appreciate it.
I have been involved with prison ministry for quite some time. And I just want to say that you're one of the few lucky ones that have come out, you know what I mean, in one piece, able to establish yourself. But I don't want to send a negative impression to the people here. There are people inside that need volunteers. And volunteer work doesn't always mean you have to go inside. You have letter writing. You have organizations that reach out to inmates' children around Christmas time. Gives Mother's Day gifts or Father's Day gift from the inmate. Is of some of the programs. Of course, you go in and try to give if you want to go in. They do have Bible studies and ministers that come in. You know what I mean, and try to help. One of the main things that I realized is in the DMV area, the recidivism rate is very high. That's number one. Recidivism rate is very high. And my research tells me the reason why it's so high is because we can't find housing for individuals that come out after they spent anywhere between 7 to 35 years. Okay? So they say that if an individual comes out and doesn't have a place to stay, then 60% of them will commit a crime intentionally to get locked up, to go back inside because at least they have 3 hots in the cot. Does that make sense? So our society doesn't provide umbrellas for inmates, male, female. So what I've done over the years is I put 26 different companies from the DMV area, including the mayor's office, because the mayor has right up the street. They have an organization right here, right around the corner, which is a DC government building that's ran by inmates. That director had a murder charge, okay, who they found out after 22 years that the murder charge was reversed. And they gave him, DC government gave him an undergrad degree from Howard, and he's supposed to get a doctorate, a PhD, got his master's from Morgan, and supposed to get a PhD at Harvard, okay? But what I want to say is that what I do and what I have done is bring 19 to 24 organizations in the DMV area under one roof, okay? Because stuff that's needed, like for instance, how do I get an ID? How do I get my social security card? How do I get a bank account? I have banks that come in and give inmate returning citizens, regardless of their credit, because they don't have no credit, give them a bank account so they don't have to go to these expensive check cashing places and give 40% of their check to them, you know, housing, sponging accounts, charges, jobs for people with felony charges, okay, and stuff like that. So we bring them haircuts, showers, food, you know what I mean? And how do I get to these people? Well, I take flyers and I do personally and have a group, some people, we do hand-to-hand combat. What's hand-to-hand combat? We go where they are. on the streets. You know what I mean? And it's hard to get volunteers to do programs because what has to happen is for inmates to come in, I'm gonna say this and shut up. What has to happen is what we have to do is give people a hand and a lift up and allow them to be productive citizens of this society.
No, that's true, and thank you for that. Definitely. And I would just say this, you know, it's a trip like the prison establishment or the prison complex should have everyone that get out should have a social security card. They should definitely have their paper ID or their card ID because they have the power to do that. But they don't, and when you don't give a person their social security card that's been gone 20, 30 years, everybody done died off in their family, you can't get a job when you get out. That's the one thing you need for a job, and that takes forever to get because you might not have your birth certificate. So that should be something at the prison, knowing you getting out, they should already have you in the process to get that stuff for you.
They don't even do it in the halfway house.
Yeah, see, that's deep.
You brought up something that I always want to make sure I mention is that the stories that we tell are from a very specific prison, and that's San Quentin prison, which is very different than a lot of places. And I don't want our stories to make it sound like prison isn't a horrible place, because it is. But San Quentin has a lot of resources, and that is so different. And if more prisons had the resources that San Quentin had and the amount of volunteers that go in there, they could be better places, not great places, but better places. But what you're talking about is so real. I mean, to me, those are in some ways the harder stories, the reentry ones, because as you said, Earlonne and other people that have gotten out that we know are not the majority. And I never want people to think that they are. Yeah.
I saw your hand in the back.
Yeah, so that's more as a question or like a comment. So like, here's the fact, but also like I'm with DC Justice Lab, and we're part of a coalition called Unlock the Box DC, which is to erase solitary confinement in DC jails, which is part of a national campaign of ending solitary confinement nationally. And I want to see if you guys could like, actually, like you mentioned a little bit Earlonne about like the shoe, and like this wasn't really lockdown. And can you shed a light a little bit more of that experience of solitary confinement? And in your interviews, did you find it difficult or like a difference between talking to someone who had experienced solitary confinement, and it's all the same in all different forms? They call it like protective custody, segregated,
Administrative segregation.
Yeah, so they're different. So yeah, can you just shed a little bit of light on it? And then yeah, 'cause it's a big topic. Like again, we see yesterday passed. We just introduced the bill to erase solitary confinement. Hopefully, we get a hearing on it. So can you just talk about like that?
Yes. So solitary confinement or usually it start off at administrative segregation, where either there was a violation done, or in California at one point, it don't even have to be a violation done. You could just be an associate of someone. Maybe she's a gang member and I'm an associate of her, and I go to the hole indefinitely based on that. We've talked to individuals that spent upwards to 30, 40 years in solitary confinement. No crimes committed, just based on their influence. They outlawed it in California. Actually, in 2013, the guys inside of solitary confinement did a hunger strike, and that hunger strike got the attention, national attention. So the courts basically settled, or CDCR settled with the courts, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. They settled where you can't do over, I think, 5 years in solitary confinement. That's a long. And the one thing I can say, you know, far as I spent a total of 29 months in solitary confinement. And the one thing I can say is, you know, when you're in prison, I guess your mind do what's best for you, whereas you can deal with it. And you can deal with it because it's all you have. You know, you can't, I think I was just more of, I don't really, I don't trip on things that I don't control. You know what I'm saying? Like I adjust to it. And I think most people in those situations adjust to that, because at the end of the day, whether you're on the main line or you're in solitary confinement, you're still locked up. So for some people, like if you watch lockup shows, you see people banging their heads on the wall. That's not the average person. That's mental health. And they'll pass it off that that's the average. That's not the average. Like the average person is not banging their head on the glass or stuff like that. And those individuals that's doing that shouldn't be in solitary confinement. Because again, it's mental health. But it is a code too that they use. And again, they used it for years and years and years and years in California up until 2013. And they still using it. It still go on, but not as long. They may let you out and then they come up with some more information and put you back. So it still goes on, but you can't do it for long periods of time. And the story we did, I think it was one of our submissions in the contest, and it's called The Shoe. And we talked to a gang of individuals that served lengthy times in the shoe and how it affected them, how they didn't have touch, didn't touch another person for years, couldn't visit their families, face to face. It was always through a glass. Watch their kids grow up like that. And again, a lot of these individuals did not have a crime. They was there just based on someone said something about this person, or something to that effect. Yes.
So I'm reading the question for a friend. There is an interesting intersection between adoption and incarceration. Have you ever thought about exploring that?
Really? I did not know that.
I told her to expand.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so, like I said, I teach poetry at the
Right.
Inspirational Women, and I noticed that a lot of the women have gone from foster care, and then I posed the question where did you guys adopted? Over 80% of them raised their hand, and so, and then I talked to the numbers that once they came out, whatever, and a lot of them were adopted. But and then when I was studying, I just got my master's degree from Howard, and when I was studying,
Congrats.
But while I was studying it, a lot of the they talk about foster care a lot, but there's nothing on adoption, and there's and then with adoption and incarceration, there's absolutely nothing. So I was there is an intersection. I just want to know if you guys.
No, I'm curious though.
Yeah.
Well, in prison systems, juvenile and adult, what they have is an intake system for everybody that walks in that door, right? And that intake is where you get all your research from, okay? Intake form never asks individuals, juveniles or adults, have they been adopted? They ask several specific questions, but one is, do you live with both parents? And if you say no, the next question is, which one is absent? And 96% of them say my father. Okay, so there's a lot of research on that, but you're not going to find research on, coming from inmates for adoption because it's not in the application process.
And I would say that as you answer them questions and ask them questions, they're either favorable points or they're disfavorable points. Meaning, if you came to prison before this time, that's points. If you didn't have two parent household, that's points. And you might end up in a higher custody based on your answers.
I feel like you were asking a question and we ran away from you. You wanted that was your question? Okay, sorry. Just want to make sure we didn't leave you behind.
Let me know when you come in there. Make sure that's a box. We have time for one more question. Okay, we'll take your two. Okay.
Yes.
I volunteer with DC Books and Prisons, one of dozens of grassroots organizations across the country that responds to individual inmates' requests for reading material, because I think that 70% of prisoners are functionally illiterate or don't have more than a 4th grade reading level, which is also a key instance. But as part of this, we send books. We send 10,000 packages a year, but I also support prison book clubs, and I was wondering if there are any books that you would recommend, other than This Is Ear Husband. You're sending Soledad Brothers, The Letters of George, Jackson, we send Parabola, or we send The Handmaid's Tale, we send fiction, we send nonfiction. Is there anything that you would recommend?
It's a trip. You know, Nigel said earlier, you get a blank. But so it's a trip. I have a lot of friends. I mean, if I can get your card, we can go from there. But I have a lot of friends that write great books, and they are in prison, and they write definitely interactive workbooks. You know what I'm saying? To where it's changing people's mindsets. Okay, that's what's up. Way out there. Damn.
Wait. What was the book you loved so much when you were in prison? I know there were a few.
No, the Alchemist. Yeah, that was one that I read. That was an interesting story. It took me right back to the beginning, I guess.
Oh, what books? What would I recommend? I mean, just great literature.
We get requests for everything.
Yeah.
These are the tough requests, but we get requests for the complete works of William Shakespeare.
Yeah.
In quantum physics and for great math.
Yeah, I mean, I just think good books. What I hate is when people donate their crappy books to prison. It's like, donate good books, man. Donate a book you'd want to read that's in good shape.
Is there a book that you?
Earlonne got mine, The Alchemist. Yeah, that's just amazing look across the board, no matter where you're at.
I don't know. There's one called the America's Conduct, Inner City Escort. It's by a cat named Larry Davis, and he really delves into, society, where it was and where it's at, far as, especially it deals with LA gangs, and how that came about, based on the conditions.
And also, I was just thinking too, if you like The Alchemist, Conversations with God is a good book as well that delves deep into some really philosophical questions and answers it profoundly. So, I saw your hand.
Yes.
Okay, so I have a question. Will you all consider a follow-up interview for Leslie Van, is it Houghton?
Houghton?
Houghton, yes, since she's been paroled?
Nope.
Okay.
Only because she's disappearing. That's all.
And I understand that. Yeah. And I understand it completely. And one thing I do want to say as well is I don't know how I wound up listening to you both, but I do.
Thank you.
I've enjoyed the travels to the Scandinavian countries when you go to visit the prisons and how individuals are able to walk out, do a job.
Totally
They
different.
go back to prison or jail, whatever they call it there, because they know that these people have a family to take care of and things like that. And they're just trying to, contribute back to society and fulfill their debt to society as well as, that type of thing.
Yeah. So we was in Norway prisons, and I sometimes come to the conclusion, and my conclusion might be flawed, but if it's a country with their own people, they take care of them no matter where they at. So that's the only conclusion that I have to that.
I would just say I love that story about Leslie. That was one of my favorites.
And we would have definitely wanted to follow up, but she gave 50 some years of her life to that system, and she just like, whatever I got left, I want to just do me. Yes.
So with that, we have to sadly close the discussion. Thank you guys for Thank you guys for joining us, having this discussion. Earlonne and Nigel will be signing. They're going to be sitting on the stage, so you guys can come on up to the table, get your copy if you brought a copy, bring it on up, get it signed, let us see your beautiful faces, say hi. Thank you, John Elliott, and
What?
You guys have been an amazing audience. I hope you all get home safe, and thank you for spending your time.
Thank you. Definitely a pleasure.